Sounds good. Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Jacobs. I'm the new director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service here at the University of Florida. I want to welcome you to this evening's program. One of the real pillars of the Bob Graham Center's initiatives over the last several years has been its public programming. And we have a real tradition of using this public program to provoke thoughtful discussion about really important issues that face the community of Gainesville, the broader state of Florida, the United States as a whole, or the world. And tonight's event is going to continue that tradition, I think, as we're looking at race, history, and political participation in America. So I want to welcome you all to the event tonight, and thank you for coming. I think we've got a couple of great speakers. I'm going to introduce the speakers here in just a moment. The basic format is that they'll each speak, I think, for about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up to Q&A. Afterwards, I believe each has some books for sale as well, potentially, a book signing. If we'd love to have you participate in that as well. So again, welcome. So our two speakers tonight are Dr. Sharon Austin, who earned her, she's professor in political science and director of the African American Studies program here at the University of Florida. She earned her PhD from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. We won't hold that against you here, but we welcome that. What's that? Okay, Albert, excellent. So her teaching interests are in American government, urban politics, and African American politics, and her research interests are African American mayoral elections, rural African American political activism, and African American political behavior. Her first book, Race, Power, and Political Emergence in Memphis, was published in 2000 by Garland Publishing. She's also published scholarly articles in a long list of journals, some of which I'll mention here: the National Political Science Review, the Journal of National Conference of Black Political Scientists, the Journal of Black Studies, and Politics and Policy, and has written several book chapters. Her second book, The Transformation of Plantation Politics in the Mississippi Delta, was published by the State University Press of New York in 2006, and her third book just recently came out, The Caribbeanization of Black Politics, Race, Group Consciousness, and Political Participation in America, and that's with State University of New York Press, and that's a 2018 publication. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Paul Ortiz. I won't say how long I've known Paul Ortiz. That goes back to our graduate school days where he was at Duke and I was at UNC, and I think I was an interloper on the Duke intramural basketball team for the history department there. Yeah, I won't go that far. But so Dr. Ortiz is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Office is right upstairs here in Pugh Hall. Under his leadership, the Proctor Program has received multiple national awards, raised more than $1 million in grants and contracts, and has really become a model for the social justice methodologies in oral history worldwide. I mean, it really has established a worldwide reputation under his leadership. It has also earned the 2013 Stetson Kennedy Vox Populi Award for outstanding achievement using oral history to create a more humane and just world. He served as president of the Oral History Association as well as vice president and chair of the nominating committee. He is also on the editorial boards for CALFU, a journal of comparative and relational ethnic studies, and the Palgrave Studies in Oral History. And he's a postdoctoral fellow mentor for both the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation and the Ford Foundation Fellowship Program. So obviously he's got a very broad national reputation here as well. He has published 3 books. The first is Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, with the University of California Press from 2005. Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Jim Crow South, with a new press, which went into its 4th printing in 2014, and I don't know if it's got a 5th or 6th printing by this point or not. And then most recently again in 2018, an African American and Latinx History of the United States, Revisioning American History, published by Beacon Press. So I'd like to welcome our speakers here tonight. Again, I think this is another opportunity, another event in this long tradition of public programs here at the Graham Center that really are intended to sort of provoke thoughtful discussion of really critical issues here. So I'll turn it over to our panelists. I'm not sure who's going to go first here.
All right. Okay, I hope this works. Yeah. All right, thank you all very much for coming out. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, I first want to mention an activity that we have coming up next Friday on February 22nd as part of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary for the African American Studies program. Next Friday evening at 6 o'clock p.m. in the Rion Ballroom in the Rights Union. If you look at the very bottom of the page, we will have a guest speaker, and the speaker will be Dr. Stacy Patton, who's done a lot of research on African American children. And at first, Leslie McSpadden, who is the mother of Michael Brown, whom, as many of you know, was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. At first, she was going to be able to come, but she won't be able to come until September. But every year, the program has the annual Foreman Lecture, which we use to try to honor and keep alive the memory of our first director, Dr. Ronald Foreman, who served for 30 years as director of the program. And so Dr. Patton will be here next Friday. So I did want to go ahead and mention that before I get started. Well, tonight I want to talk about a book that was just published last year. I want to focus on the Miami chapter and talk a little bit about me and about the research that I do, and in particular talk about this project that I worked on for 7 years. I was finally able to get it published last year. So first, thank you for the introduction, but I've been here at UF since 2001. I'm currently a professor of political science. I'm also the director of the African American Studies program. I've been in political science since 2001. I've been director of African American Studies since 2011. I'm a married mother of 2 almost teenagers, which is hard to believe. My daughter will be 13 next month, and she's about this tall. My son is 14, he's about that tall. So I have 2 children. I'm originally from the city of Memphis, and also, as Dr. Jacobs just mentioned, I'm a proud alumnus of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I received a PhD from there in political science in 1993. So that tells you a little bit about me. So the title of my book that I'll be talking about tonight is The Caribbeanization of Black Politics, Race, Group Consciousness, and Political Participation in America, that was just published in February of last year. And so in the book, I look at 4 cities, the cities of Boston, Chicago, Miami, and New York City. I started work on this project shortly after I came to UF, because coming from Memphis, unfortunately Memphis is a very racially polarized city. And in Memphis, when you think about people in the Black community, you mostly are talking about people who are African American. But then when I moved here to Florida, I met people who are Black but who don't consider themselves to be African American, even though I guess they're brown in terms of their skin color. Some of them even get offended when you refer to them as being African American. And so in my African American politics classes over the years, I talked to a lot of students who were Haitian and Jamaican and who were from other places in the Caribbean. And they talked about some of the stereotypes that their parents had about African Americans. And I know even from my own upbringing in Memphis and just hearing about people talk about things like something I'm going to mention today, some of the things that happened beginning in the 1980s with the influx of the growth in the number of Haitian immigrants. I heard a lot of African Americans say negative things about Haitians in particular. So in having those discussions in my class over the years, it kind of made me wonder just what exactly is the relationship like between African Americans and people who are also Black, but they're also of Caribbean descent mostly. So I looked at these 4 cities in particular because in Boston there's a growing Haitian population. I use the term Haitian and also the term West Indian and distinguish between the 2 in each of the cities. And also in Boston, there's a large Cape Verdean community, and these are people who are from, I guess, the Cape Verde Islands, who are mostly African, who are also brown, but they also in some cases don't consider themselves to be Black. They consider themselves to be, in some cases, even white. They consider themselves to be Portuguese. So I looked at the city of Boston because there's what's called an ethnic diversification taking place in these 4 cities and in many others across the nation, because there are more Black immigrants moving into these cities. And so what I looked at in the book is, and I look at the question as to what exactly is the relationship between these Black immigrants and also native-born African Americans. And in each of these cities, native-born African Americans have struggled for many years for political power with some mixed success. So how do they feel about this influx of Black immigrants coming in? Do they compete with them? Do they believe in coalitions with them? So that's the overall theme of the book. So I looked at the city of Boston, also the city of Chicago, which in suburban Chicago near, I guess, Evanston, Illinois, there's a growing Haitian population. In the city of Miami, which of course in the Miami metropolitan area has a very large Haitian community, and also other West Indians also live in the city of Miami, and also in New York City, which has the largest West Indian population in the country, and also is a very ethnically diverse community in the Black community, because there are a number of Black immigrants who've moved there over the last few decades. So these are the 4 questions that I primarily look at in the book. First of all, what racial identification or identifications do these people that I refer to as Black ethnics, who are mostly people who are naturalized Black citizens, who used to be Black immigrants, many of them, what racial identification do they have? Or in other words, if you were to ask them to check a box, do they identify as being Black? Even though in our society we would assume that they are because of their appearance, do they actually think of themselves as Black? Is the first question. Secondly, do African Americans and Black ethnics have what's called a shared racial group consciousness? Or in other words, how much solidarity, especially in politics, are they willing to work together, and how much racial solidarity do they have with each other? And that also ties into the question as to how do they feel about each other? Do they have stereotypes? Do they believe in working together? Do they believe in something called linked fate, is something that I talk about, that if something affects one Black person, it also affects all Black people equally. So how much racial solidarity do they have as Black people? And then third, what political activities do they participate in, and also to what extent are these activities influenced by their racial group consciousness or their racial group solidarity? Do they vote? Do they engage in activities with their elected officials? Do they attend community organizational meetings? Just what exactly, what type of political activities do they tend to engage in? And then the last question, I guess the most important one, is will the growing populations of Black ethnics enhance Black political power in these 4 cities? Because one of the things that I just mentioned is that Blacks traditionally have struggled for political power for a number of reasons in each of these 4 cities. So with the influx of Black immigrants, is that going to help African Americans? Is that going to enhance Black political power overall? Or are they going to compete with each other and not really gain very much political power just as Blacks as a group? So those are the 4 questions that I look at throughout the book, and I want to go through this kind of quickly, but Miami is at one time was a very segregated city. So when you think about segregation, for example, my parents are from Mississippi, I'm from Tennessee, and so when you think about those places, you know that there was a lot of segregation before the modern civil rights movement. But Miami was also a very segregated city, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the Miami chapter. At one time, especially a lot of famous Black entertainers, for example, couldn't stay in certain hotels. They could perform there, but they couldn't stay at the hotel, so they had to go to Liberty City and to Overtown and to predominantly Black communities because they couldn't get hotel rooms. So that's an example of some of the segregation that took place in Miami for many, many years. And even now, Miami, despite the fact that it's a very diverse city, it still has a lot of racial polarization there. So that's one of the things that I talk about in the chapter. Also, when it comes to political power, African Americans have traditionally had, and still do, have a very weak degree of political power in Miami and also in Miami-Dade County. And a lot of that is because of the way that the governmental system is set up. African Americans, and also Blacks just in general, mostly live in small municipalities in the Miami area, but just countywide in Miami-Dade County, just as a group, they've always lacked a lot of political power. And as many of you know, if you're from South Florida, or even if you're not, the people who have the most power in the Miami metropolitan area are either white Cubans, not Afro-Cubans, but white Cubans, and also Anglos, or whites, even though they're the minority, have a lot of political power as opposed to African Americans and other Black immigrants and other Black ethnics who have very little. And a lot of that is because of the history of the racial strife and the racial polarization in Miami. So there are a number of reasons as to why African Americans or Blacks just in general have not had a lot of political success until recent years in Miami. And first of all, it's because of their small population countywide. And then also, as many of you know who are familiar with South Florida, the Miami metropolitan area is very spread out, it's highly populated. And so in terms of Black communities, there are Black neighborhoods in certain municipalities, but countywide, African Americans have never really had a large population. And so that's one of the reasons why they've never really been able to get a lot of political power, never really been able to elect a lot of people in office. And then also the voter registration and turnout rates among blacks, not just in Miami, but I would guess you would say nationwide, always tend to be much lower than white turnout rates. And maybe that might have been a little bit different in 2008 and 2012 because of President Obama. But traditionally, blacks have always had a much lower voter registration rate and a much lower voter turnout rate than whites. And so that's the case in Miami. And they also have tended to have a lower registration and turnout rate than white Cubans as well in Miami. And then I mentioned the governmental system, the metropolitan government, which was established in 1957, which put people of color in general, for a long time, even Cubans had a lot of difficulty electing people in political offices because of the governmental structure in Miami that made it very difficult for people of color to amass political power simply because their population is so widely dispersed and there are not a lot of predominantly minority neighborhoods. And then also Miami, like I guess every other city, has had its experiences with prejudice, with discrimination. There were 4 race riots that took place in the 1980s. In particular, there was one that took place with a man that I mentioned in the book by the name of Arthur McDuffie, who was killed by the police, and the police falsified it. So they have had, despite the image of Miami as a place that's great for tourists, they have had a lot of racial strife, and that has gone on for many, many decades, but in particular, during the 1980s and the 1990s. So beginning in the 1960s, the first Haitian immigrants came to Miami, but it was during probably around the 1980s that you began to see a lot of national news coverage of these quote unquote Haitian boat people. And so across the nation, you saw images like this on the local news in cities across the nation. And so as a result of these negative images of these quote unquote Haitian boat people, a lot of people believed in a lot of really negative stereotypes about Haitians. And also African Americans also, not just whites, but African Americans also believed in these really negative stereotypes. The belief was that these people were coming to this country, they were poor, they had nothing to offer, they were disease-ridden, they were just coming to South Florida and in particular to Miami in large numbers. And there were large numbers of people who happened to be Haitian and other black immigrants coming to Miami, but a lot of the stereotypes were based on racism. A lot of the stereotypes that we at first believed, especially during the 1980s, before we knew a lot about AIDS, the belief was that this was the group that was bringing AIDS to America. And so as a result, a lot of people in Miami and in every, I guess, racial group had a lot of hostility toward Haitian boat people, and they believed in these negative stereotypes that we later found were not true. So I'll go through this quickly, but these are just some of the things that we talk about in some of my classes in terms of the way the Haitians were treated. And I'm always surprised that a lot of my students are completely unfamiliar with this. At one time before approximately 1989, Haitians couldn't give blood. And the reason was because of something I just mentioned. They were believed to be the only quote unquote non-homosexual group that had a high percentage of AIDS patients. So again, it was based on this stereotype that these Haitian boat people were coming to America and they were bringing AIDS, and as a result, there were higher incidences of AIDS in their group, and so as a result of that, Haitians couldn't give blood. And it wasn't until for a very long time that was the case. And then also there was something, and I guess you could argue, I guess the wet foot, dry foot policy was established in 1966 in something called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And at that time, this was definitely a double standard between Haitian immigrants and Cuban immigrants, in particular Haitian immigrants and white Cuban immigrants, because the wet foot, dry foot policy said basically that if a person who happened to be Cuban, for example, reached the shore, or if that person was able to get dry feet, then that person could apply for political asylum and possibly remain in this country. But if a person who is Haitian reached the shore and had dry feet, for example, they were nevertheless sent back. And the reason for that was because Cubans were thought to be political refugees who were fleeing communism, who were fleeing, I guess, the Castro regime. And that's not to say that Cubans were ever treated well, because they weren't. But nevertheless, they were treated in a way that was much different and much better than Haitian immigrants were. So they were allowed to apply for political asylums if they reached the shore. Haitians, on the other hand, were nevertheless sent back. And so as a result, you saw more and more of these Haitian boat people trying to come to America. And in many cases, some of them came to America illegally. But the reason for that was because even if they had tried to come here legally, they wouldn't have been able to. And a lot of that was because of prejudice and discrimination. They were not able to immigrate to this country legally because they were thought of as economic refugees, as people who had nothing to offer, who were very poor, who were going to come to South Florida, who were going to bring down the economy. And so as a result, there was this double standard in place. And some people would argue even today there still is a double standard in place that puts Haitian immigrants at a disadvantage when they're trying to come to this country legally. There also was a lot of job competition in the 1980s because at one time there was an economic downturn, and in particular between African Americans and Haitians, there were a lot of competition for jobs. And so that led to a lot of tensions between these two groups because African Americans in some cases perceived Haitians as people who were coming to South Florida and who were basically taking jobs that they rightfully deserved. So that led to a lot of tensions as well. So as a result of all of these and a lot of other things that I mentioned in the book, both of these groups had negative perceptions and also negative stereotypes about each other. In 1992, a very important federal case took place called Meek versus Metropolitan-Dade County. And in this federal lawsuit, which was filed, a class action suit that was filed by Black and Hispanic plaintiffs, as a result of the ruling in this case, which was named after then Congresswoman Carrie Meek, at-large or citywide elections were replaced with district elections. And so for the first time, a number of African American and also Latinx individuals held political office for the first time. So this is a quote from the book. Before this 1992 ruling, only one African American and one Latino had ever served on the commission at any one time. So even with, I guess, white Cubans, they had a large population, even they were having a lot of difficulty because of the governmental system and because of these at-large elections. So after these at-large elections were eliminated, there were major changes immediately in the years afterwards. So by the early 2000s, as I point out in the chapter, 6 Hispanics, 4 African Americans, and 3 non-Hispanic whites served on the commission. So it went from being a practically all-white commission to being one that finally had an inclusion of people who were African American and Latinx. So this was something that was really important in terms of the growth in minority political power in Miami. So these are the 2 people who were the lead plaintiffs in that case, former Congresswoman Carrie Meek and also the late Arthur Teal, who was a very prominent Black Republican in Miami. So when it comes to Haitian American politics in Miami, the growth in the numbers of Haitians in office has been very impressive within, I guess, the last 20 years. So, and this is one of the things that I point out in the book, before 2000, there were no Haitian Americans who had ever been elected anywhere in Miami or in Miami-Dade County. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, even though they had been immigrating to this country since the 1960s, there had been none in office before 2000. But since the early 2000s, Haitians have even elected majorities on the city councils and some of the municipalities, especially in North Miami. They've had a lot of success there. At one time, they had a Haitian American mayor. So considering all the things that I've mentioned about the way they were treated and all of, I guess, the obstacles and barriers that they had to overcome in coming here, the growth in Haitian American political power has been really impressive in just the last, I guess, couple of decades. So in terms of the findings that I mentioned, and then one of the things that I noticed in each of the cities, the findings were really similar. So in terms of in Miami, the first research question that I asked was, what is their racial identification? So do people whom in American society, whom we would consider to be Black, do they actually identify as being Black? These people who are African American, who are Haitian, who are Jamaican, etc., do they think of themselves as being Black? And I don't know if y'all can see this all that clearly, but one of the things that really surprised me was that practically all of them said that they consider themselves to be Black. So the number for African Americans, 100% of the people that I interviewed, and I did, I guess in all of the 4 cities, there were over 2,000 interviews that when my students were able to conduct. So practically all of the African Americans said that when they were asked the question, what is your racial identification? Are you Black, white, Latinx, Asian American, mostly all of them said black. And this is the difference between first generation and second generation black immigrants. So with the black ethnics that I interviewed, a substantial number of them also identified as being black. So this, I don't know if you can see this, but it says 98% of the first generation, in this case, Haitians, and the darker color are people who are considered to be West Indian. So 98% of the first generation Haitian people that I interviewed consider themselves to be black. All of the first generation West Indian people that I interviewed consider themselves to be black. In terms of the second generation people that I interviewed, these are people who are mostly younger, and all of them also identified as being black. So I guess the issue is that they identify as being black, but one of the things that all of them pointed out, all of the black ethnics that I interviewed in all 4 cities pointed out, is that despite the fact that they think of themselves as being black, they don't think of themselves necessarily as being African American. So in other words, I'm black, but I'm not African American, I'm Haitian American, I'm Jamaican American. So in each city, they sort of distinguished, they made sure that they made that clear. So the second question involved whether or not they support political coalitions or whether they're willing to work together, I guess, politically to achieve their goals. So, and looking at that question, I can barely see this myself, but a number, the overwhelming majority of them believed, and this is the African Americans, I think 98% of them said that yes, we do support political collaboration. So despite whatever stereotypes or whatever conflicts they may have of each other, they believe in working with black ethnics. So that was the case for African Americans, the overwhelming majority. So for first generation Haitians, I can't, approximately, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. But again, for first and second generation Haitians, the numbers are much smaller. Even though they support political coalitions, they don't support them as universally as African Americans do. So that was something that I guess is a positive thing, but I guess it all depends on how you interpret this. In some sense, first and second generation Haitians and West Indians support collaboration, but not nearly in as high a percentage as African Americans do. So in terms of the other questions, the third question that I asked is what political activities do they engage in? So I found that they vote at very high levels. African Americans tend to have a higher, I guess, voting percentage than the other groups, but all of them tend to have high voter turnouts. But even though they vote in high percentages and they vote at high levels, nevertheless, they don't really participate in very many other political activities, in particular, the black ethnics that I interviewed. So, and then they, in terms of the percentages who participate in other political activities, very few of them do. And that was something that I found not only surprising, but I also found disappointing. So less than 10% of all of them, African Americans, Haitians, and West Indians, less than 10% of them say that they consistently attend political rallies, that they don't really belong to community and political organizations. Very few of them, this is, I guess, lesser the case for Haitians, very few of them donate funds for political causes, and very few of them have ever contacted an elected official. So even though they understand and they engage in voting, they don't really participate in very many other political activities. So I guess the question that I'm thinking about for, I guess, whatever my next project is what will these Haitian political victories mean for African American political power? It's something that I started to address in this book, but in terms of Haitian Americans being as successful as they've been over the last 2 decades, what will this mean for African American political power in the future? Because so far they're indicating that they believe in collaboration, that they want to work together, but I mean, will there be a sense of competition if there continues to be a case in which Haitian Americans are successful, African Americans are less successful? Will there be conflicts between them if this is something that continues? And then one of the things that I noticed, not only in Miami, but surprisingly also in New York City, very few West Indians have won offices in Miami. Now that's not the case in Broward County, which I didn't look at in this book, but in Miami and in Miami-Dade County, very few West Indians have ever held political office, even though they have a large population. And then surprisingly, in the New York chapter, even though West Indians have the largest population there in the country, even surprisingly there in recent years, very few West Indians have won political offices. At one time during probably around the 1980s, West Indians were winning political offices in New York City, but in recent decades, they haven't really been able to win very many political offices. And so that's one of the questions that I want to look at in my next project. Why is this the case? Because they vote and they believe in politics and they have an interest in politics, but they have not really been winning political office in recent years. So that's a second thing to think about. And then thirdly, I guess one of the more important questions is, what should these groups do to increase their political power? They believe in working together, but how can they work together? How can they put their differences aside in order to work together to increase their political power in Miami and in the other cities as Black people? All right, so I'll just go ahead and stop there. And thank you very much. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to see if I can find. There we go. Like Dr. Sharon Austin, I'm a program director, and so unsurprisingly, I'm beginning just like she did with some announcements. And first of all, let me say what an honor it is to be with Dr. Austin. One of the great things teaching here has been able to share so many students kind of back and forth. And I've been here long enough now to where we can actually not only share students between our classes and, you know, whether it's Latinx history, Caribbean, legal history, African American history, but also now we can talk about successful alumna, right, and alumni. And that's such a wonderful thing. So I just want to say again how honored I am to be able to be in the same podium with her. And also to be introduced by Dr. Matt Jacobs. And Matt's absolutely correct. We actually, our relationship initially wasn't academic, it was athletic. And he was one of the great contributors to our Duke History Department basketball team, which made it to the championship, the intramural championships, which was a big deal because when you made it to the championships, you actually played in the mecca of college basketball, Cameron Indoor Stadium, which Matt may disagree with, is the mecca of college basketball, right? But it's just really great to be here. And again, thank you for the invitation. And also congratulations to Matt as the new director of the Bob Graham Center. Let's give him a round of applause. It's great to have such great alliances between the three of us, right? My announcements are, and many of you already are aware of this symposium coming up. Both the Bob Graham Center and African American Studies are co-sponsors of this, but we have an African American History Symposium. It's a national event coming up March 21st to 23rd, even though it's national, and even though we have these amazing scholars coming from the West Coast and the Northeast, we're using this symposium to honor a local person by the name of Joelle Buchanan, who I think many of you knew. Joelle was among that first cohort of African American students who integrated Gainesville High School, paid a terrible price, a terrible psychic price, a lot of harassment, racism. But when I met Joelle, when I first came here as an anonymous grad student in '97 from Duke, he was the one who introduced me to so many different Black communities in the region. And actually, I had known him for a total, I think, of 3 days, and he took me out to do an oral history interview with his mother. And that's the kind of person he was. He was a bridge builder. So we want to take this national symposium to honor a great person. So I hope you'll join us for that. And there's information, pamphlets we passed around. The other one is next week. I've been asked by the African Student Union. We're honoring Nelson Mandela. I think this is the 7th annual event. The African Student Union has done really good work. I'll be giving a lecture there, not as much about Nelson Mandela, but about South African trade unionism, including an amazing organizer by the name of Emma Mashinini, who was a key member of the anti-apartheid movement, who wrote a wonderful book called Strikes Have Followed Me All My Life. So that's going to be here next week at Pugh Hall. So I want to talk about an African-American Latinx history of the United States. And like Dr. Austin's research, a lot of this comes out of my own personal background, research, but also my classroom experiences. A lot of the students that I've worked with here, to echo what Dr. Austin was saying, are actually Haitian American. They're first-generation Latinx students, increasing numbers of Puerto Rican and actually Mexican American students. That's my background. So I was born in 1964. I lived most of my early life on the West Coast, grew up in a shipyard town and other military towns. And when I was growing up, you didn't read much or learn much about any of the history that's in this book. And the idea behind this book is to place Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean at the center of U.S. history from the very beginning. And not to say, well, it just begins with 1898 or World War II, but from the very beginning, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence, what's happening in Cuba, have a key role to play in the development of this country. Now, where do I get that kind of orientation? Well, it comes about from my own personal experiences. And so I grew up, one of the towns I lived in for a number of years, after my mom's first divorce, she remarried, we moved to a town called San Leandro, California. And San Leandro was an incredibly racist town. The Department of Justice came and did a major investigation. After the investigation, the Chronicle there was a big infamous headline saying, San Leandro, the most racist town in America, which probably was not true. But as a kid, I remember Ku Klux Klan rallies in downtown San Leandro. This is in East Bay, California, a 45-minute drive from Berkeley. And so that was the kind of environment that we grew up in. This is an item from a few years after we moved out. So later on, I went into the U.S. military, and I served in Central America in U.S. Special Forces. And this is another really critical part of this book, is to see U.S. history not from the vantage point of what I was taught, from the vantage point of people in this country, but to try to understand what the U.S. looks like from people outside the United States. Because now many of those people are here, right? It's what Juan Gonzalez calls harvest of empire. And when I was in Central America in the 80s, a lot of people from the countries that I was in, including Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, and many others, would ask me, what are you doing here? And I would tell them, what I thought I was doing there, and they'd say, well, how long are you guys going to keep coming here? Because the countries I was in Central America, the U.S. had been going there since the early 19th and late 18th century. And in the classroom, when I'm teaching courses with students from Haitian American, Mexican American backgrounds, and we talk about things like isolationism. That was a key term, phrase in U.S. history that I learned in college. They think it's a joke. They're like, are you kidding me? The U.S. has always been in Haiti. The U.S. has always been in Cuba. The U.S. has always been in Mexico. And so a lot of the old ideas, conceptions in U.S. history just don't work if you look very candidly, and especially from a perspective of people who have been the subject or the object of U.S. foreign policy. One of the ways I think my work connects with Dr. Austin's is to think about the Haitian and Haitian American experience. So in the 18th and 19th century, most African Americans see Haiti very differently than people in Miami see Haiti in the 1980s, and there's historical reasons for that. And Dr. Austin has wonderfully touched upon those. In the 19th century, Haiti is really seen as a beacon of liberty, not only in the United States, but throughout the entire Americas. If you look at people like Antonio Maceo, Jose Marti, Simon Bolivar, the list goes on and on. The new work on the Mexican War of Independence is talking about Haitian freedom fighters fighting alongside Mexicans against the Spanish in the 1810s. When Frederick Douglass gives this talk, and I won't read this verbatim, when he gives this talk about, and he's in Chicago in 1980, or this is not, actually 1893, I apologize, this is a typo, in 1893 rather, he's giving a talk at the end of the 19th century. He's very advanced in age. He's going to die within about a year or two after this. But one of the amazing things about this is he's talking about where we as Negro people owe our freedom. And it's a longer speech, but he goes through the great abolitionists like Garrison, Clarkson, Wilberforce, and he says, yeah, we owe them a lot. We're very grateful to them, but we owe incomparably more to Haiti than to them all. And this is something that is not taught in schools. It is never taught in schools how much we owe to Haitians, how much we owe to Mexico, how Cuba, how Central America, how Latin America, how Africa has enriched the democratic history of this country. Never has been, or rarely has been taught in schools. Sometimes you get to college, right? Because if you have a robust ethnic studies, African American studies program, then you'll learn these types of things, but if not, you don't learn them. And I think when we talk about coalition building, it's impossible to think about building coalitions if, number one, you don't know your own people's history, and then number two, someone says, well, why don't you cooperate with this other group? And if you don't know your own group's history, your own family's history, then how can you even hope to form a political coalition? And so many of my students, whether it was when I taught at UC Santa Cruz for 7 years or here, have asked me point blank, where is our people's history? Where's my parents' history in this? I don't see this in your mainstream history classes, and that's really the impetus for an African American Latinx history in the United States. There are many incidents, and the reason chapter 1 of the book talks so much about Haiti is Haiti has so many intimate connections to the U.S., really from the American Revolution forward. This is a key battle, the Siege of Savannah, that Haitian American volunteers take part in and actually save the Continental Army from total destruction. The colonel, who is the head of the British forces, the invasion force for the Redcoats, will later on be the head of the British invasion force that attempts to reimpose slavery on Haiti in the early 19th century. Maitland, it's a real one of these ironies of history. If you go to the first African Baptist church in Savannah, which is the oldest continuously African American church in the United States, you'll see one of a very new monument, which is dedicated to some of the Haitian soldiers who served in the American Revolution. It's a really remarkable monument. In class, we actually kind of walk around it in a virtual way. It's very impressive. And some of the individuals who came to fight with the 13 colonies on behalf of the American Revolution actually will later become leaders of the Haitian Revolution against the French, the Spanish, and the British. But Haiti is seen as the key to liberty. Every early U.S. slave revolt, and I cannot overemphasize this, keys in on Haiti in one way or the other. Every Latin American war of independence in some way keys on Haiti one way or the other. So Venezuela is one of many examples. Those of you who know Venezuelan history will know that the original history in Venezuela was taught to recognize this connection between Venezuela and Haiti and the role that Haiti played in offering sanctuary to freedom fighters. The other, we move to chapter 2. The argument here is the Mexican War of Independence has a pivotal impact on U.S. history. Mexico, for example, abolishes slavery very early on, and many of the leaders of the Mexican War of Independence from 1810 and 1821 are people of African and indigenous and European descent, many of them mixed, all three. And so when they offer sanctuary to escaped African American slaves, it's what this newer research we have into the Underground Railroad, it's believed now that maybe as many African American slaves escaped to the south, to Mexico, as to Canada. And that research really is just getting underway in many ways. But if you look at early African American newspapers, there's tremendous hope and joy expressed at these Latin American independence wars. If you flip that over, though, and part of the fun things about the book was reading the correspondence of people like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Madison. They're horrified at the Haitian Revolution. They're horrified about the Mexican War of Independence. They're horrified at these Latin American independence wars because these wars strike at slavery. They strike at the oppression of indigenous or native people. They're much more egalitarian than the American Revolution was, and hence there's an effort from really the beginning to build if not a physical wall or barrier, but an ideological barrier between Latin America, Central America, and the United States. So I see what Donald Trump does today as very historically rooted in ways that go back to his great idol, who's his favorite president, Andrew Jackson, right? There's a really strong connection between those. So I'm not going to talk too much about these slides in the interest of time, but my wife Sheila and I who really, I need to give major props to, did as much research on this book probably as I did. We were together in the archives. She hates to be acknowledged, so I'm not going to do it. But she is sitting there with petitions, which we'd like you to sign afterwards. But we were in Mexico City over Christmas break. Mexico City, by the way, is a great place to lose weight in, actually. And some of you have mentioned this to me. How do you look so much better? I'm like, well, yeah. But going to Mexico City, and seeing the murals and seeing the connections between indigenous history, African history, European history, the history of colonialism, these are really powerful images that you can see that were created in the wake of the Mexican Revolution in the 20th century, which talk about the struggles of African, indigenous descent, mixed race peoples in Mexico. We have nothing like this in the United States, but we're developing it. If you go to East Los Angeles, if you go to some places in San Antonio and Houston, you're going to begin to see this type of art, and it's really amazing. But the overall understanding from Rivera, Charlot, and Seguera, is the great troika of the 1930s era muralists in Mexico, is to talk about the legacies of colonialism, of domination, of European racism. We are so ignorant of each other's struggles, but when we get to learn them, right, it's like the scales fall off our eyes. For example, I taught my department's first Latino history survey course last year, and it was amazing because so many of the students who were educated in Miami, Dr. Austin, would say, growing up in Miami, we were never taught to see the Spanish as colonists or colonial power. And I would say, you weren't? And they said, well, we learned how bad the British were, the French were, the Dutch. Well, that's in continuation of history. That's called the Black Legend. And the broader meaning of that is that all the different colonial powers say, well, if you're British, the Dutch were the really bad people. You're Dutch, the French were the worst, right? And but it was very interesting to get that kind of thing. So I'm gonna, one more thing about the early chapters. I'm going to kind of jump forward. People ask me what was my favorite part in researching the book, but so chapter 2 again, Mexican War of Independence, is this amazing possibility, this amazing moment. And I talk to my students a lot about use your historical imagination. Think about what happened, but also think about what could have happened, how U.S. history could have been so different if certain things, if certain conjunctural points had turned out differently. So one of these possibilities is one of the greatest leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, Jose Maria Morelos, is writing directly to James Madison. And to read these letters is really an amazing experience, and it really brings tears to my eyes because I think about what could have been. Here, Morelos, but others are asking the U.S., they're saying, hey, you all just finished fighting an anti-colonial war. What if we join forces against these grasping, greedy Europeans? The British have just burned down your capital. You know they're coming back. The French are coming back, and all the others. What if we formed an alliance against the grasping Europeans? And that was the language that was used. I had to translate the letters, of course. What do you think the outcome was? Do you think that James Madison said, yeah, let's form an alliance? If certain decisions are made, the history could have been so different, right? Doesn't mean it can't be different now. So I'm going to fast forward to, you have the handout there that talks about the chapters of the book. We get to chapter 3 and chapter 4, Reconstruction in an Internationalist Vein. I talk a lot about these unknown Mexican-American abolitionists. Many of them are writing in California, Arizona. There's a Spanish language abolitionist press that most people know about. But again, it's coming out in schools. This is a mural of Francisco P. Ramirez, one of the greatest Mexican-American abolitionists, who's caught in California because after the U.S. invasion of Mexico, which Mexican abolitionists define as a war to extend slavery, to reimpose slavery into Mexico, he's kind of stranded now in the United States, right? But the mural was done by high school kids. And a lot of my talks now are teachers' workshops and talks to high schools. And it's really inspiring to see this because certain school districts, not the majority, but certain of them, and I was in Montgomery County, Maryland, over the summer and did an all-day workshop with 71 social studies chairs. That's a district that serves 170,000 students. They're they're revolutionizing their curriculum. So they took African American Latinx history of the U.S. and we went through it chapter by chapter and gave them primary sources because they're like, we're a majority minority school district now. We have a lot of Caribbean descent students, a lot of Latin American descent students, a lot of African and East European descent students. That old curriculum, you know, we love George Washington, we love Hamilton, all the others, but the kids just put their heads in the desk and go to sleep, right? They want to see something from their own families and backgrounds. So Frederick Douglass, of course, Reconstruction, and some of this was very, I mean, a lot of the research was humbling for me because I'm going over eras and key moments in U.S. history like Reconstruction, which I thought I knew, but which I didn't really know at all. So chapter 1, or actually chapter 4, the first sentence in chapter 4 on Reconstruction says, African Americans decided that emancipation in one country was not enough. And the great African American abolitionists, most of them, not all of them, most of them, like Frederick Douglass and Garnett and others, say, how could we dismantle our anti-slavery organizations at the end of the Civil War when we have slavery 90 miles up the coast of the U.S., when Brazil is still in bondage, when we're not even sure serfdom is really finished in Russia. And so they create international anti-slavery organizations building on their organizations which already were in existence, which had always been international. Because the slavery and the struggle against it was always an international struggle. And these are some of the leaders of the Cuban anti-slavery movement. If you're familiar with African American history, you'll recognize them. I talk about this thing called emancipatory internationalism, which is simply that, I mean, I can be, you know, if you think of coalition building, you don't have to give up your identity, but it means you're in solidarity with people who are struggling against oppression in other places. The middle part of the book, a lot of it is talking about African American critiques of U.S. imperialism in Central America. There's a number of missions the NAACP, investigative missions the NAACP launches to explore why is it the U.S. has invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1915. And the finding by James Weldon Johnson is it's about the takeover of the Haitian national debt, the financialization, the fact that New York banks are able to use U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Marines to take control of an entire debt, okay? And so, but it's really the NAACP that does that great investigative work. This is published both in The Crisis, which W.E.B. Du Bois is editing at the time, and also The Nation magazine. The last thing I'll say before I move to the last chapter and really conclude is what was humbling for me was to think about my experience in Special Forces and how we were there opposed to people like, you know, the Sandinistas, but then years later to read African American newspapers in the 1920s who lionized Sandino, who you know, the New York Times referred to him, the U.S. government referred to Sandino as a criminal, a robber, you know, a lowlife. If you looked in African American newspapers, though, they ran long pieces about people like Sandino and other people who opposed U.S. occupations. They said, how can it be that the U.S. says it's bringing democracy to Central America when we don't even have it here, right? They've disenfranchised us here. What makes you think that they went to Nicaragua or Honduras or any other places to actually bring democracy? So the book concludes on, people have asked me, you know, this is a reinterpretation of history. Is it hopeful? Is it depressing? Or, you know, whatever. I don't know. I mean, it depends on how you read the book. But it ends by talking, the last chapter, about the impact, the unfolding impact of the 2006 general strike, which I argue we don't quite know yet. It's still having this amazing impact. What we do know is that a lot of movements come out of the general strike in 2006. You know, one of them is the Fight for 15 in a Union movement, the living wage movement. A lot of Black Lives Matter organizers learn how to organize during that general strike. So initially it begins as a strike against, you know, kind of like anti-Latino racism, but it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's an international, phenomenon. It's not just a strike that happens in one place. It's nationwide and involves people from almost every nation on the planet by the end of it. One of my favorite stories is that, again, I've taught just long enough to where a lot of my students now are actually, labor organizers, and they were keeping me abreast of what was happening in North Carolina around this time. And the North Carolina workers, a lot of them, the first generation workers, actually risked their jobs and went on strike to try to force their employer to allow them to recognize MLK Day as a holiday. And their supervisors said, well, you don't know who MLK is. You're from Nicaragua or Honduras. You immigrants don't know. And they're like, yeah, we do. We probably know more about him than you do. He is a working class hero to us. And they actually risked their jobs to honor that, to try to get the holiday. But the general strike, I argue, and this is kind of a lead up to the general strike, was really important because, again, it gives people organizing experiences. We've never, I guess the takeaway from the book, to kind of, in closing, is we've never, people of color, you look out, when I teach classes and 85% of the students are women and students of color, think back to 1783. What rights did we have under the U.S. Constitution? 0. We had to fight for all those rights. They were never granted us, never given to us. And so the general strike is just a reminder and a continuation of that history. We've never been able to look back to the vision of the Founding Fathers and to say, we're just trying to honor that vision. Instead, we've had to really fight where we are for a modicum of democracy and justice. And so that kind of gives you an overview of the book. Again, it's an attempt to really reinterpret U.S. history from a grassroots perspective and really from a social movements perspective. And again, the history is unfolding even as we speak. You could look at Donald Trump as being a continuation of a lot of bad things in U.S. history. But if you look at the resistance to white nationalism, that's inspiring too. But I'll say that as long as you teach a nationalist perspective of history, as long as you teach the U.S. is isolated from other nations, as long as you teach the U.S. is innocent of the foibles and follies of the other nations, you're going to get white nationalism. It's going to continue. So you've got to do something different, and that's what this book is an attempt to do. So thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Austin. We have some time for some questions, and we've obviously got a mic here, and I'm happy to walk around and hand it to whoever might have some questions to ask. So, any? Okay. Beat you with his hand here.
Dr. Ortiz, Haiti at the time of the revolution was considered a relatively rich country, and yet now is considered one of the poorest countries in the world. Did the European demand for compensation for the war have anything to do with that? And if so,
Yes.
to what degree?
So absolutely. So in chapter 1, I talk briefly about, essentially, if you think about France, Great Britain, the U.S., and European powers, they're always squabbling and fighting, even fighting wars with each other. But there's really one topic they can agree on in the early 19th century, and that is Haiti to them is what they call a contagion of liberty, right? They have to find a way to isolate it. And so one of the ways is to refuse trade relations, to, as you kind of alluded to, an unofficial embargo. France is actually getting compensation from Haiti for the Haitian abolition of slavery. And when people tell me today, oh, slavery reparations are impossible, I say, ask the French government. They got slavery reparations for over a century, which were de facto enforced by the British and the Americans. The U.S. withheld diplomatic recognition of Haiti until right up to the U.S. Civil War. It was a key topic again in the radical kind of black abolitionist movement. Why don't we how could we call ourselves a democracy when we refuse to recognize Haiti, but it was all about keeping Haiti impoverished. The last thing I'll say about this is I served with a lot of people who took part in when the U.S. Special Forces went in with Jean Bertrand Aristide, right? And what they found, and one of my friends, actually Stan Goff, wrote a book called Hideous Dream, was that the U.S. never really wanted Haitian civil society to succeed. And from the very outset, the U.S. has really been opposed to Haiti in many ways. President Clinton recently apologized for terrible, horrific trade policies which drove out the Haitian rice industry. But it always seems to be that way. It's always like an apology 10 or 15 years after the fact.
Yeah, that apology was in 2010 when Clinton was trying to become the head of the relief agency after the Haitian earthquake. And he was describing policies in NAFTA. But what I want to ask you about is, with the coming shutdown, has anybody considered that the 2 million people who are going to be laid off should be organizing to go on strike to demand that such a shutdown and layoff shall never happen again, because this is basic to not having a slave society?
A general strike. Well, people are calling, you know, there are folks calling for a general strike. I think that the thing that really caused the government, the federal government, to get its act together at the end of the last shutdown were TSA workers, airline attendants, people beginning to talk about, you know, not only not reporting to work, but in a very public way, beginning to talk about, well, we can do this too. And the connection to African American Latinx history of the U.S. is the general strike in '06 was really calling a bluff. And the bluff was, if you hate Mexican people so much, if you despise us that you're going to pass law after law against us in the federal legislature, well, try this. We just won't show up for work. And see how your economy likes it. And the research behind that is fascinating. The Wall Street Journal doesn't want you to know this, but Cargill shuts down. Tyson shuts down. Trucking on the West Coast paralyzed. Okay, because that's really the power of collective organization.
Yeah, but I think people need to go on strike, but there's also the fear factor, because you have some people who are afraid that if I go on strike, I can easily be replaced.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, when the
Exactly.
shutdown has no money, it's a lot harder to get the scabs to come in.
Chris,
Chris,
great
hey.
to see you guys. I don't know if you've touched on this before, but right now, past 3-4 days, Haiti has had riots about the rising prices of oil in their country. Has a lot to do with what's going on in Venezuela, with Venezuela being a major exporter to the Caribbean as far as oil. But just to look at the political situation in Haiti, what do you think the kind of political ideology of Haitians in America have to do with the foreign policy that we've seen exhibited in Haiti over the past couple of years? Has a lot to do with class society, with most of the rich in Haiti being the top 5%, what we would consider mulatto within the African American community. A lot of Haitians that have the money to leave Haiti and live in America and abroad, in France and Canada, are sometimes considered right-wingers or center-right. So can you touch upon the political ideology of Haitians in America and what that has to do with them advocating for foreign policy in Haiti?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say that Haitians, I guess, are more likely to have a right-wing ideology. But I wrote an op-ed a few months ago, and one of the things that I found interesting was that, I don't know if this relates to your question, but probably about 20% of Haitians voted for President Trump in 2016. And, you know, for any black group, that's a really high percentage. So one of the things that I found in my book, in all 4 of the cities, is that Haitians tend to have Haitian Americans have a strong commitment to Haitian issues. They tend to donate funds for Haitian causes, and they tend to donate funds a lot more frequently than the other Black groups that I interviewed. So I wouldn't say that the Haitians who've immigrated and assimilated in American culture, that they've forgotten about Haiti, because I found that, especially in New York City, they have a lot of Haitian hometown associations, and those people have more of an interest in Haitian issues than Haitian American issues in New York City. So, yeah.
Dr. Austin, you sort of touched upon this in your last comment. My question was, in the other 3 cities, you reviewed your findings in Miami. In your other 3 cities, New York, Boston, and Chicago, did you find any striking or surprising trends that were different from the ones you found in Miami?
The one thing that surprised me was the fact that there were so many similarities in all 4 of the cities, but the one thing that I found striking in all of the cities, especially in New York City, is the lack of involvement of West Indians in politics. I found that, I think I mentioned this, New York City has the largest West Indian population in the nation, but yet they only currently have maybe about 3 or 4 West, maybe they might have improved in recent years, but during the time that I was conducting interviews, they only had about 3 or 4 West Indians serving in office. So to me, that was something that was striking. And one of the other things I found in the South Florida area is that even though West Indians have been very successful in Broward County, they haven't been as successful in Miami-Dade and in the surrounding communities in the Miami metropolitan areas. So that was one of the things that I couldn't help but wonder, if you know anything about South Florida, the counties are right next to each other. So why are they so successful in Broward, but so, have achieved so little success in Miami-Dade County? So those are probably 2 of the most striking differences that I found.
Any other questions?
I guess Dr. Ortiz, this would be for you. Is that, could you explore this whole notion of the 1848 Mexican-American War having as much to do with the desire to spread slavery and cotton growing resource as much as anything else? I think some of the other stuff was just made up in order to carry out that particular desire on the part of the U.S.
It's great insight. I mean, I was really, like most school children in my generation, propagandized to learn about something called the Mexican-American War. What is that? That never even existed. Even mainstream newspapers in the 1830s and 1840s understood this was a war about slavery. And then later, people make up terms like manifest destiny to kind of water down what was really happening. If you looked at the Mexican Congress, everyone knew in Mexico what the war was about. Frederick Douglass is one of the outstanding characters I, again, key on, because I think I showed this wonderful mural, which is actually in West Belfast. And getting to your question, West Belfast, Northern Ireland, and the people of Northern Ireland talk about Douglass, and they still talk about his trip to his speaking engagements in the 1840s, because Douglass originally went to kind of to pay homage to Wilberforce and some of the great British abolitionists. He stops over in Ireland. This is kind of a famous story, which I'll dramatically kind of collapse. But the Irish resistance movement kind of connects to Douglass, and they say, the British really oppress us badly here. They've taken all of our land, they starve us, they take all of our wealth on a continuous basis, they've colonized us, and Douglass learns. And he also brings that critique of the war that you're mentioning to say, even before the war starts, he said, basically, this is what the U.S. has at stake in Mexico. This is why it doesn't like Mexico. Not only does it want to take over the land, but it wants to shut down Mexico as a place that provides sanctuary to African American slaves. But one of the great things is that even though the U.S. wins the war and takes a lot of Mexican property, it can't quite squelch those great ideas. So people like Langston Hughes in the early 20th century, Langston Hughes' father actually moves to Mexico, becomes a successful businessman. Langston actually writes The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of the greatest poems in American history, on his way to visit his father in Mexico. And so there's a lot of these great connections. Elizabeth Catlett who's a victim of McCarthyism, a great African-American artist, actually spends the last 40 or so years of her life in Mexico City, in many ways rising to the top of Mexican artistic culture, doing all sorts of different artistic things about the history of African descent people in Mexico and the Americas. So there's so many great connections, but you really have to get beyond the kind of what I call what other people call the propaganda of history. And one of those propaganda moments is that the U.S. and Mexico just happen to disagree with each other, and there's this, right? But that's not true. And yeah.
One final question.
Thank you so much. I would like to understand more about the relationship between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, because when there was the earthquake, when there were people that were hurting, why didn't they just go into the Dominican Republic? I don't understand that relationship, why it's kept unequal.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of tensions between Haitians and Dominicans, and that's one of the things that I'm disappointed about in this book is that I had a chapter on Afro-Latinos, and the publisher told me to take it out because they didn't want the book to have too many pages. And I was real disappointed because in that chapter I looked at some interviews that I did with Afro-Cubans in Miami and also with Dominicans in each of the 4 cities. But there has always been a lot of tension between Haitians and the Dominican Republic, even though they're on the same island, they're like almost separated by one thin line. A lot of it is because of, I guess, the color issues. A lot of Dominicans don't consider themselves to be black. They think that Haitians are black, but they're not. So if you have a person who is Dominican who has dark skin, nevertheless, that person doesn't consider himself or herself to be black. And so there are a lot of complex racial issues. And then also, I think some Dominicans believe in a lot of the stereotypes, and they also believe a lot of the negative information about Haitians being poor. And as a result, they think that if a lot of Haitians come to the Dominican Republic and settle there, then they will bring down the economy, they will bring poverty, they will bring problems. And so a lot of the same stereotypes that some Americans have about Haitians, a lot of Dominicans have those same stereotypes. So there have been historical tensions between them for many years.
Yeah. This is a whole different, we could spend hours on just this one question. I'll mention 2 things. One is, more recently, great writers like Edwidge Danticat, who many of you are familiar with, Junot Diaz, have taken on this issue, really head on in their work. One, obviously Diaz from the Dominican diaspora, Edwidge Danticat from the Haitian diaspora, and really have tried to raise these questions, why the disagreements? I'll say in brief, early on in my chapters, I talk about the intense racism of the Spanish Empire. And the DR is a descendant of that intense racism. It used to be that people would teach, the Spanish, the Portuguese weren't quite as racist in the way they set up their empires as the British or the French. Not true. Absolutely not true. And so those racial stereotypes go back really generations and centuries. But again, I think there have been efforts to try to ask these questions, And the last thing I'll mention is that in 1938, this is like you, a lot of what I wanted to be in the book got cut, because for good reasons. Because number one, Beacon Press is one of the great presses in the world, and they said, historians write books that are too long, no one's going to read it. It's got to be 300 pages or less. But here's a story that didn't end up in the book. So in 1938, there was a conference on the fate of German Jewish refugees. It was held in France. All the nations were there, and all the Western nations. And it got around to the crisis that Jewish people were facing in Germany. And they were already being put into camps and being brutalized and fleeing the nation, fleeing Nazi Germany. But it got to the action part. And the U.S. delegation said, well, we would like to help, but it's a mistake to allow one's sympathy to interfere with one's laws, and we're a nation of laws. And you could just hear the sigh of relief. France delegation jumped up and said, we're a nation of laws too. The Great Britain, we're a nation of laws. We all have quotas. We would love to help the poor Jewish refugees, but we're all nations of laws. We can't help them. denying the centuries of vicious anti-Semitism in all of those countries, right? The U.S., France, Great Britain, all the others. Two nations step up and say, you know, you all have colluded to prevent us from having from having a lot of, a navy or ships, but we'll step forward and we'll take as many refugees as you can help us get to our respective countries. Guess what those two nations were? Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And I found this out by reading a Jewish newspaper published in Montreal in French. And don't ask me what I was reading, why I was reading a Jewish newspaper published in Montreal in the 1950s, right? But I just love microfilm. And every year, this community, the Jewish community in Montreal would have a special occasion where they would thank the people of Haiti for stepping forward during our time of need. Not the United States, not France, but Haiti. And actually, Haiti was able to take some Jewish refugees, but not as many. At one point, in one document says, the Haitian delegation said, we'll take 10,000. It's just we don't have the capacity to do so.
On that powerful note, we'll need to wrap it up. I want to thank all of you again for your participation, and especially want to thank Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Austin. As I said, each does have some books available for sale in the back, and obviously they're welcome to stick around and ask them, speak with you individually as well. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you both.